"The best gift would be if you died," she said. The words fell like glass, sharp, glittering, and everywhere. The sound didn't echo. It stuck to the air. I was still holding the cake, 2 layers of chocolate and strawberries sliding under the weight of my trembling hands. 20 candles hissed in the draft like they were afraid to exist. She stood there, arms crossed, doorway bright behind her, face calm. I searched for even a flicker of shame in her eyes, but there was none. Only impatience, the quiet kind that tells you you've outstayed your welcome. And right then, I realized. She didn't just want me gone from her house. She wanted me gone from the world. My name is Evelyn Grace Walker, and I'm 69 years old. I used to think I understood what love was. Sacrifice, patience, endless forgiveness. I was wrong. Love, the way I practiced it, was a slow erasure of myself. I had built my life around one belief, that a good mother never stops giving. But that belief has a cost, and I paid it with everything I had, my time, my savings, my peace. That night, at my daughter's 45th birthday, I learned that even devotion has limits. I'd arrived early, smiling like an old habit, carrying the cake I'd ordered from her favorite bakery. I remember thinking she'd light up when she saw it, the way she used to when she was small. Instead, she sighed, the kind of sigh that says you've already ruined her day. She let me in without a hug. The house smelled of roses and expensive candles, a house I had helped her buy. Every wall was painted in quiet perfection, every vase perfectly arranged. Everything I had given her surrounded me like evidence. We sat across from each other in the living room. I tried to make conversation, but she scrolled through her phone, her face lit by the screen instead of the woman who raised her. I told her the cake might melt. She didn't answer. I mentioned her children, my grandchildren, and she said they were fine without lifting her eyes. Then, with the calm of someone discussing the weather, she said, "We need to talk." It's strange how 4 words can drain all the light from a room. She set her phone down, folded her hands, and said it, the line that split my life in 2. The best gift would be if you died. I didn't speak. My body felt heavy, my throat dry. I remember staring at the frosting, watching a strawberry slide down the side of the cake. My first thought was not about death. It was about how quietly cruelty can sound when spoken by someone you love. When I finally stood, she looked almost relieved. I placed the cake on her table and said softly, "Blow out your candles before they melt." My voice didn't shake, though my heart did. Then I turned and walked away. The drive home was silent. I didn't turn on the radio. Even music felt like too much company. The road blurred in the rain, headlights cutting through the fog like questions with no answers. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rear-view mirror, tired eyes, jaw clenched, lipstick smudged. I looked like a stranger I was finally ready to meet. When I reached my house, I didn't cry. I set my purse down, made tea, and sat in the dark. The ticking clock was the only sound, a reminder that time still moved even when you no longer wanted it to. Then, slowly, I began to breathe again. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, I knew what I had to do. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the glowing screen. I logged into the bank account that had carried her through every crisis, every whim. The cursor blinked beside her name, steady and patient, waiting for me to act. My finger hovered, shaking only once before pressing cancel. It was the smallest sound, a single click, but it thundered through the house like freedom breaking loose. That was the moment I stopped being afraid to live without her. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I started to live for me. Tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know who's listening tonight, and if you've ever had to find your courage the hard way. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of strength, dignity, and rebirth. The silence after cruelty is not really silence. It hums. It sticks to your ribs like smoke in old curtains. When I drove away from Lauren's house that day, I could still hear her voice echoing inside the car, replaying that sentence until it lost shape, until gift and died became 2 meaningless sounds rubbing together. I kept both hands on the wheel, not because I was afraid of crashing, but because if I let go, I might have turned back. 69 years teaches you that sometimes survival looks like leaving without a scene. I drove through streets I'd memorized from years of school pickups and grocery runs, but they looked different now, emptier, stripped of purpose. The grocery store where I used to buy her favorite yogurt, the park where she pushed her first stroller, the cafe where she once told me she couldn't afford her bills, and I handed over my savings without hesitation. Each building stood like a witness to my foolish loyalty. At the stoplight, a man in the next car glanced at me. I must have looked strange, an older woman gripping the steering wheel, face wet, mouth trembling, but silent. He gave me a polite nod, that American kindness reserved for strangers in mild distress. I wanted to tell him, "Don't worry, I'm not dying. I'm just being reborn in slow motion." When I reached home, the house greeted me with the kind of stillness that follows long companionship. I'd bought it 30 years ago, back when Lauren still thought sleeping in my bed was the safest place in the world. There was a photo on the hallway wall, her at 8, missing a front tooth, holding a puppy I rescued from a shelter. Her eyes were full of promise back then, not calculation. I touched the frame lightly, the way one touches something fragile that no longer belongs to them. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. I sat at the table with my purse still over my shoulder, staring at the wood grain like it might reveal instructions. The smell of strawberries lingered on my fingers, faint now, like the ghost of sweetness. I realized I hadn't eaten all day. That's when the shaking started, not sobs, not even tears yet, just my hands trembling in quiet rebellion. My body was finally catching up to what my heart already knew. Something had ended. Not motherhood itself, but the illusion that motherhood meant endless forgiveness. I used to think that love could fix broken people, that if I just gave more, money, time, patience, they'd remember how to love me back. But love without boundaries isn't love. It's self-erasure. It's bleeding slowly while smiling so nobody sees the stain. I went to the sink, filled a glass with cold water, and took a long sip. The taste of metal grounded me. The fridge hummed, steady, indifferent. For a moment I wanted to call her, to ask if she meant it, if maybe she'd been joking, if perhaps I'd misunderstood. But another voice inside me, smaller yet steadier, whispered, "You heard her the first time." So I didn't call. I turned off my phone. The screen went dark, and the quiet that followed was the first peace I'd felt in years. That night, I lay awake, listening to the old pipes groan in the walls. I thought of my own mother, how she once told me that people like us are meant to endure, not to escape. She was wrong. Endurance is not grace. It's just survival on repeat. I realized I didn't want to endure anymore. I wanted to live. When dawn broke, pale and slow, I made myself tea and opened my laptop. The online banking page blinked at me like an invitation. Every monthly transfer I'd been sending Lauren sat there, neat as habit. I hovered the cursor over cancel. My breath came shallow. Then I clicked. Once. Twice. The sound was small but final, like a door closing gently. It wasn't revenge. It was air. I wrote her name on a scrap of paper, just her first name, and stared at it. I whispered it once, then tore it in half, then again, until it was confetti. The pieces fell into my teacup, floating like soft ashes. I watched them sink slowly, the water turning cloudy. I didn't cry. There's a point beyond crying where women my age go. A quiet plain where dignity starts to grow again, wild and stubborn like weeds through concrete. Later that morning, the mail arrived. A flyer for a cruise to Switzerland. I smiled at the coincidence. The word escape was printed in silver letters across the cover. I wasn't ready to book anything yet, but the image of blue mountains and clean air felt like a promise. I stood at my window, sunlight painting stripes on the floor. Outside, a neighbor's wind chime played a hesitant tune. It reminded me that life keeps moving, even when you stop participating. That was the moment I decided that leaving wouldn't be an act of abandonment. It would be an act of respect. For myself. For the woman who had given too much, forgiven too much, and was finally ready to breathe without permission. I took another sip of tea, bitter now, and whispered to no one. This is where it changes. There is a ledger only a mother keeps, columns of small rescues no one else remembers. Mine began with bus routes and lunch boxes. When Lauren was little, I woke before the sun, ironed uniforms until the pleats obeyed, then caught the first bus to the hospital laundry. The steam rooms were a second weather system. Clouds of heat swallowed me whole. My hands lived in bleach. I learned to fold sheets so crisp they could stand. When I came home, I smelled like other people's sickness. Still, I would press my cheek to Lauren's hair and tell her stories while the washing machine at home thumped like a second heartbeat. We learned to stretch $1 until it sang. I rolled coins at the kitchen table, paper tubes fattening under my thumbs. I clipped coupons so neatly the cashier once asked if I worked for the store. On cold mornings, I rubbed Vaseline into Lauren's knuckles so they wouldn't crack. I bought her winter coats second-hand, then stitched satin ribbon inside the neck so they felt special. When field trip permission slips came with suggested donations, I covered the whole class more than once. Anonymous, I'd write. It felt like tucking the world in. In middle school, when Lauren wanted violin lessons because her friend played, I said yes and sold my grandmother's porcelain to cover the first months. In high school, when she wanted the cheer jacket with her name stitched on the sleeve, I pretended not to notice it cost more than my shoes. I told myself I was buying her a childhood I never had. That's how silent abuse can grow in a home. Not with shouted insults, but with the unspoken rule that one person's comfort outweighs another's exhaustion. The first time Lauren asked for my credit card just to hold the hotel room, I handed it over. She was 17 then, going to a debate trip 2 towns over. She came home with a souvenir sweatshirt and a vague apology for a small charge. I paid it and said nothing. Ungrateful children are not born. They are trained by our softest silences. College came like a tidal wave. Application fees, dorm deposits, textbooks stacked like bricks. I ran extra loads at the hospital, volunteered for the shifts others refused. Holidays when the hallways echoed and the cafeteria served grief on plastic trays. I packed care boxes with ramen and handwritten notes, tucked $5 bills between pages of poetry she said she loved. When the financial aid office called about a gap, I filled it. When the old car died, I co-signed a different future. Her first apartment smelled like new paint and hope. I stood on the balcony with her, looking at a sky that seemed to belong to both of us. We built that little place together, my hands and her lists, a sofa found on clearance, a toaster that burned on one side, a rug that shed like a long-haired cat. When rent jumped the first time, I covered the difference, just for a while. "You're my hero," she texted with 3 heart emojis. I saved it like proof. Then there was the man, Evan, charming as a summer storm and just as unreliable. He laughed the first night we met, told me I danced like a jukebox. I wanted to believe in him because he made Lauren's eyes spark. They married in a backyard under strands of thrifted lights. I paid the caterer. I made the bouquets. I didn't mind. There was a sweetness to it, a promise stitched into the edges. Family, belonging, rescue as ritual. We call it love when it's happening. Later, sometimes, we call it a mistake. When they wanted a house, I put my signature beside theirs. The down payment came from the fund I had been feeding for decades, a little each paycheck, a swell of relief when the balance grew. I told myself it was an investment in future Thanksgivings, in grandchildren stomping across floors I helped lay. Paperwork has a way of disguising sacrifice as paperwork. I remember the pen felt heavy. I remember thinking, this is what mothers do. We say yes until we become a hinge. After Tyler was born, I babysat so they could get back on their feet. I loved it. Tiny socks on the radiator, milk dribbles on my blouse, naps with a warm, damp head on my shoulder. But even sweetness can become currency. When daycare fees rose, I adjusted my hours. When Evan's business hit a rough patch, I covered the car repairs. I paid for insurance quietly, slid grocery gift cards into Lauren's palm like contraband. "What would I do without you?" she said more than once. I took the sentence as affection. It was logistics. There were warning signs, of course, small splinters you ignore until they fester. Lauren's sigh when I suggested she call the bank herself. The way her thank you texts narrowed from full sentences to a single thumbs up. The afternoon, she emailed me a spreadsheet titled Monthly Needs, like I was her employer. I printed it and smoothed it with my hand, heat rising in my chest. A mother as a cash machine, insert guilt, receive deposit, no receipt, no respect. Even holidays turned into invoices. I brought pies and was handed lists. I wrapped gifts and was asked about utilities. I told myself this was temporary, that stress had reshaped my gentle girl into something harder. I did not want to name it betrayal. Family betrayal wears her face. It is easier to accuse the mirror than the person you love. It's funny what you remember. The night before her 30th birthday, I stayed up hemming a dress she loved, pricking my finger in the half-light, a small crimson bead on the fabric. She twirled the next day and didn't notice the work stitched into the seam. Love is invisible on purpose, I used to say. Now I wonder if making it invisible lets people forget. There is a moment in every long giving when you feel the hinge loosen, the door begin to sag. Mine was a Tuesday, years before the sentence that cracked me open. Lauren sent a text. "Rent due tomorrow. Handle it?" "No, please." No context. I remember placing my phone face down, listening to the refrigerator hum and thinking, what if I said no? The thought was so radical it made my heartbeat stutter. I didn't say no. Not then. I paid it. I kept the machine running, the quiet hero, the dependable yes. But a yes delivered too often curdles. It turns into resentment, into nights you cannot sleep, into mornings where your jaw aches from clenching. It becomes a life you don't recognize. By the time I stood in her doorway with a cake and heard her wish, the ledger had grown into a scroll. And in the blank space at the bottom, my name, for once, was waiting. I wish I could tell you the last straw was dramatic. It wasn't. It was the sound of my own breath, steady and small, reminding me that even the softest woman can learn to set a boundary that will not move. And then came the little humiliations that taught me how. Abuse doesn't always announce itself. It sneaks in wearing gratitude's clothes. It begins with a sigh, a roll of the eyes, a never mind. I used to think those were small things, harmless ticks in our conversations. Now I know they were the earliest fractures in a wall I had been building with love. The first time Lauren made me feel small, she did it with a smile. She was 23, newly married, and I had brought over a casserole, my way of saying congratulations on the new apartment. "Oh, Mom," she laughed, opening the foil. "People don't really eat these anymore." "It was a joke," she said later, when she saw my face fall. "You're too sensitive," she added, and there it was, the first lesson of silent abuse. If you feel hurt, it's your fault for feeling. Over the years, those little jokes became sharper, her tone smoother, her patience thinner. "Mom, you don't have to visit every weekend." "Mom, that dress makes you look old-fashioned." "Mom, don't worry about the kids. I don't want them to pick up your habits." Each sentence was a paper cut, tiny and precise, impossible to show to anyone without sounding dramatic. Friends would say, "She's just independent, Evelyn," as if independence required cruelty. Money became her favorite language of control. At first, she asked kindly, soft-voiced, grateful, "You've always been so good with finances, Mom. Could you help us just this once?" Just this once stretched into a decade. Every thank you grew shorter, every repayment postponed until it evaporated. I noticed she started saying my money when she talked about the transfers I sent. My car, my mortgage, my savings. Possession is contagious when you've been taught to give without question. I remember one afternoon, she must have been in her mid-30s then, when she stopped by my house. She looked around the small kitchen I'd kept since before her college years and said, "You should really sell this place, Mom. Move into something smaller. You don't need all this." She meant the memories. She meant the space to breathe. "You could give me part of the equity," she added casually. It's not like you're going to live forever. I laughed. I actually laughed because the absurdity of it made sense in our twisted logic. She wasn't cruel, I told myself, just practical. I didn't realize that I had raised a woman who mistook my selflessness for an endless well. There were apologies sometimes, soft, shallow ones. A text at midnight. Sorry I snapped earlier, long day. And then a photo of the grandkids, as if cuteness could erase cruelty. I clung to those apologies like oxygen. They gave me just enough air to stay. But the real violence was quieter. It lived in the pauses after I spoke. In the way she'd scroll through her phone while I tried to tell a story. In the way she'd sigh when I laughed too loudly, as if joy had an expiration date. It lived in her corrections, how she'd fix my grammar, roll her eyes when I mentioned faith, or call my memories exaggerations. That's the thing about gaslighting. It convinces you your pain is overreaction and your love is incompetence. At the hospital, where I worked until retirement, we used to clean linens for the entire building, hundreds of sheets a day. If one came back stained, we washed it again. If it came back torn, we patched it, quietly, efficiently. That was how I treated my relationship with Lauren. No matter how soiled it got, I believed I could bleach it back to pure. But some fabrics disintegrate from too much scrubbing. The day she called me dramatic for crying over a missed birthday lunch, something inside me dimmed. "Mom, stop making everything about you," she said, laughing, sipping her wine while scrolling her phone. "You're lucky to have us visit at all." Lucky. I was lucky to be tolerated by the person I raised. After she left, I sat at the dining table, the good china still out, food untouched. The house was so quiet that I could hear the ice melting in her unfinished glass. That night, I made a rule for myself: never cry in the same room twice for the same reason. I broke that rule many times before I finally kept it. Looking back, I can see how abuse became routine, camouflaged by normalcy. There were no bruises, no shouts, just the steady drip of disrespect, one drop at a time, until the floor was slick and I couldn't stand upright. The worst part wasn't the words. It was the rewriting of history. She began to tell stories in front of others where I was the burden, the fool, the overbearing mother. I laughed along because correcting her would have embarrassed her. "You always mean well, Mom," she'd say, like kindness was incompetence. And everyone would nod sympathetically, thinking she was patient, generous, the saintly daughter caring for her aging mother. That's the irony. She wore the costume of the dutiful child while I wore the invisible bruises of devotion. I learned to shrink in conversations, to choose sentences that wouldn't be used against me later. I learned to apologize first, even when I wasn't sure why. And when I couldn't sleep, I'd tell myself it was just stress, not sorrow. But every kindness she returned felt transactional, a receipt for services rendered. If I refused a request, her silence became punishment, a cold withdrawal of warmth until I caved. I became fluent in her moods, anticipating storms before they broke. That's what abuse does. It teaches you to read someone else's weather better than your own. The night before her 40th birthday, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing I had spent more of my life trying to keep her comfortable than keeping myself alive. And yet, even then, I couldn't imagine leaving. Love, when you've been conditioned to confuse it with sacrifice, can feel like gravity. I wish I could tell you that I recognized the abuse right away, but I didn't. I called it tension. I called it exhaustion. I called it motherhood. Until, one day, I called it what it really was. Love, when stretched too far, begins to sound like an apology. I spent years apologizing for things that weren't my fault, her moods, her debts, her silence. Somewhere along the way, affection had been replaced by transactions. Every hug came with a price tag. Every "I love you" felt like the prelude to a request. And I paid, I paid, in money, in time, in pieces of myself I can't ever reclaim. It didn't happen overnight. It crept in like humidity, subtle at first, then unbearable. There were moments that looked like generosity, but were actually invoices wrapped in tenderness. I remember the day she called, her voice sugar-coated. "Mom, you know how you always wanted to help with the kids' future? There's this investment plan." I didn't even let her finish. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." That was my reflex, my curse. Later, when the plan failed and the money disappeared, she never said sorry. Instead, she said, "You shouldn't have trusted that company, Mom." As if I had chosen it, as if I hadn't simply handed her what she asked for. That's how guilt becomes currency. She spent it freely, and I kept supplying it. The deeper truth was harder to admit. Giving had become my identity. Without it, I didn't know who I was. I feared that if I stopped saving her, she'd stop needing me. And without being needed, I might as well disappear. That's what dependency looks like from the other side. It's not just the child clinging to the parent. It's the parent terrified of being released. She began to expect things, not ask for them. When her car broke down, I wired money before she finished explaining. When she and her husband argued about bills, I mediated like a neutral bank manager. Once, she sent me a spreadsheet titled Projected Family Expenses. I stared at the numbers: utilities, daycare, insurance, groceries, and there, under Miscellaneous, was a line labeled Mom's Support. Not a gift, not help. Just part of the structure. I laughed out loud, a brittle sound that didn't belong to me, but I still paid. When my retirement finally came, I thought the pressure would ease. I had a pension, savings, and a little house paid off. I imagined quiet mornings, books, maybe a garden. But almost immediately, Lauren said, "Now you'll have more time to help us, right?" As if my years of labor had been a warm-up for hers. I didn't protest. I told myself she was under stress. I told myself it would change. What I didn't realize was that I was subsidizing her comfort at the cost of my survival. I skipped my own dental appointments so she could enroll her son in piano lessons. I delayed roof repairs so she could buy a bigger television. When I mentioned cutting back, she sighed, long and theatrical. "Mom, you always make things so complicated. You know I'd do the same for you." But she never did. Not once. There was a night, I think about it often, when my power bill arrived, higher than usual. I sat at the table, calculator in hand, realizing I couldn't cover both my expenses and hers that month. My stomach clenched with shame. I was 67, and for the first time since my 20s, I was scared of running out of money. I called her, hoping she'd say, "Don't worry, Mom, I've got this one." Instead, she sighed and said, "Could you hurry? The due date's tomorrow." That was the night I understood something cruel. She didn't see me as human anymore. I was infrastructure, a system, a service that ran in the background of her life. When I finally mentioned the strain, how tight things were getting, she laughed. "Mom, you've always been dramatic. You have plenty. Stop overthinking." And then, almost sweetly, she added, "I'll pay you back one day." But she never did. She paid me in crumbs of affection, little gestures that kept me hooked. A photo of the grandkids, a perfunctory "love you," an occasional Sunday visit where she'd compliment my cooking before hinting at her next financial storm. Each time I told myself this was temporary, that she'd wake up and see me again. The mother who once carried her through sickness, through heartbreak, through sleepless nights. But what she saw now was a purse with legs, a familiar source of comfort she didn't have to thank. And here's the cruelest part. She didn't have to ask anymore. I offered before she spoke. It was easier that way, to stay ahead of her disappointment. The silence after no was unbearable, so I built my life around saying yes. I thought it was love. It was fear. They say dignity erodes quietly, one compromise at a time. Mine washed away in monthly transfers and unnecessary apologies. I learned to budget for humiliation like it was a recurring bill. Sometimes I'd open my bank app and just stare at the balance, my reflection ghosted over the numbers. I'd imagine all the places I could go, all the little luxuries I'd denied myself. A trip, a class, a dress. Instead, I'd close the screen and send her another check. Because that's what mothers do, right? They give until there's nothing left to give. But even wells go dry. And when they do, the silence that follows sounds like freedom. It was one small sound, a click, soft as a whisper, but it echoed louder than any scream I'd ever held inside. The night I logged into my bank account, I wasn't planning a revolution. I just wanted to check my balance, make sure I could still cover the bills. But there it was again, her name, sitting beside every recurring transfer, every automatic payment I'd set up to make her life easier. Lauren, monthly support, a polite label for a quiet kind of slavery. I stared at that line until the screen blurred. My heart didn't pound the way it should have. It was steady. I remember thinking how peaceful the house was. The ticking clock, the refrigerator hum, the old floor creaking under my slippers. The kind of silence that asks a question. How much longer? That day had started like any other. I had spent the morning sorting laundry, folding towels, still running my life like someone might drop by unannounced. Old habits die stubborn. I'd baked banana bread, her favorite, out of muscle memory, then froze half because she'd canceled our last visit with a text that simply said, "Busy week. No sorry, no thanks for understanding. Just busy." I made tea, sat at the kitchen table. My laptop glowed in the dim light. My finger hovered over the trackpad. One small movement, and I could stop it all. The transfers, the gifts, the guilt. It terrified me that the power to change my entire life fit under one fingertip. I thought about the first time I set up those payments, how proud I was to help her get ahead, how naive I'd been to think generosity could buy respect. Each month when I saw her name appear, I told myself I was investing in love. I hadn't realized I was paying for permission to exist. I clicked edit. The cursor blinked at me, patient and unjudging. My pulse trembled in my wrist. I thought of her last words. The best gift would be if you died. The venom had settled in my body like cold lead, and here I was, still holding the poison. I whispered out loud, "No more." Then I clicked cancel. It was quiet, too quiet. No fireworks, no dramatic music, no lightning bolt of freedom, just that small final sound. But my hands started shaking and I felt something rise inside me, not fear, not sadness, relief. I leaned back in my chair and laughed, a dry, surprised sound that felt like the first breath after drowning. It wasn't loud, it wasn't pretty, but it was real. The next tab I opened was the insurance site. Her name appeared there too. Beneficiary, emergency contact, access granted. I erased it. Then I changed my will. Then the house title. Each click was another inch of skin I peeled off a life that no longer fit. Hours passed. Outside, the world was dark, but I didn't turn on the lights. I wanted the glow of the laptop, the gentle pulse of change, to be the only witness. Somewhere between deleting her name and saving the last form, I realized I was crying, but not from grief. It was something purer, something like forgiveness, but directed at myself. By midnight, the air in the house felt different, lighter. I closed the laptop and placed my palms flat on the table. I could feel my pulse beneath the skin, a soft, steady drum. I hadn't realized how loud guilt had been until it stopped. That night, I dreamed of the sea, of water so blue it burned. In the dream, I was walking along the shore, holding a heavy bag full of stones. One by one, I dropped them into the waves. Each splash was a year, a sacrifice, a promise I couldn't keep anymore. When the last stone was gone, my arms felt weightless. I woke up smiling. The next morning, I brewed coffee, stronger than usual. I opened the curtains. The sun poured in like forgiveness. I checked the bank again, out of disbelief maybe. Her name was gone. The balance looked strange without it, like a mirror missing a familiar flaw. I thought I might feel guilt, but what I felt instead was quiet joy. I walked through each room, touching the things I owned, reminding myself they were mine. The chipped blue mug, the worn couch, the quilt I'd sewn years ago. For so long, I'd lived as if my life were on loan to someone else. Now, it felt returned. Before noon, my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen. I let it buzz until it stopped. Then I blocked the number. The peace that followed was indescribable. It wasn't triumph, not even satisfaction. It was stillness, like the calm after a storm when you realize the house still stands, and you still have breath in your chest. That one click didn't just change my finances. It changed the weather inside my soul. I didn't know it then, but that sound, that soft, digital click, was the first note in the song of my freedom. It's strange how cardboard sounds when it folds, that low, grainy creak, like old bones settling into new shapes. The morning after I canceled everything, I walked into my bedroom and pulled an empty box from the closet. I hadn't decided to leave yet, not officially, but my body already knew. Sometimes the soul makes the decision first, the rest of you just catches up. I started with the smallest things: framed photos, jewelry boxes, folded sweaters that still carried my scent. I packed slowly, like each item deserved a moment of goodbye. The air smelled faintly of lavender detergent and dust. Outside, a breeze tapped the window, as if the world was politely asking if I was really doing this. On the dresser was a photo of Lauren at 6 years old, missing her front teeth, holding a melting ice cream cone. I stared at that picture for a long time. She used to smile at me, like I was her entire world. Somewhere between braces and mortgages, that look had vanished. I pressed the glass with my fingertip until it fogged. Then I slid the photo into a small envelope and labeled it for me only. The next box was heavier. Documents, notebooks, hospital pay stubs from decades ago. Each paper smelled faintly of effort. I ran my hand along the ink, remembering those years when every hour I worked meant something tangible. Tuition paid, bills caught up, shoes that fit her growing feet. Now they were just receipts of devotion. I packed them anyway, proof that I had existed as more than a wallet. Around noon, the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor, Marlene, holding a plate of cookies. "Spring cleaning?" she asked, glancing at the boxes. "Something like that," I said. Her eyes softened. "If you need help, I've got tape and a spare back." I smiled. "Thank you, but I think this is something I need to lift myself." She nodded, not prying, just leaving the plate on the counter. Chocolate chip, the kind Lauren always loved. The irony didn't go unnoticed. As the hours passed, the house began to change shape. Spaces appeared where memories had once crowded. The bookshelf looked naked, the walls lighter. I found old birthday cards from Lauren, back when her handwriting still had curls and loops. "Best mom ever." I read the words aloud, tasting the ghost of sincerity. Then I folded them carefully and placed them at the bottom of a box labeled "Truths that used to be true." In the kitchen, I opened drawers filled with things I hadn't touched in years: measuring spoons, rubber bands, keys to locks I no longer remembered. I kept one wooden spoon, the one with the burn mark from making soup the day Lauren told me she was pregnant. I had stirred so fast that the handle scorched. That burn felt symbolic now, love leaving a mark, even in the smallest places. Every object seemed to carry a sound: the clink of dishes, the scrape of hangers, the faint thud of shoes landing in an open box. Each sound said, "Let go." By late afternoon, the sun had tilted across the floor, cutting long stripes of light through the dust. I sat down on one of the boxes, catching my breath. My back ached, my knees protested, but my chest felt astonishingly light. I realized I hadn't cried all day. Not once. The house felt quieter, but not empty. Peace and sadness had learned to share the same room. That's what healing sounds like. Not laughter, not applause, just the soft rhythm of breathing without permission. I walked into Lauren's old room. It hadn't changed much since she moved out. The wallpaper was still pale pink, the dresser still scratched where she'd carved her initials as a teenager. On the nightstand was a dusty snow globe she once begged for. Inside it, a plastic ballerina twirled among glittering flakes. I shook it gently, watching the flakes swirl before settling again. The music box inside was broken, the key refusing to turn. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to fix it. There was one last drawer to open. Inside lay a collection of letters, unsent drafts, apologies I'd written and torn up, explanations I'd rehearsed but never delivered. I'm sorry for not being enough. I didn't mean to disappoint you. Please, just come visit. Each one was a relic from the religion of guilt. I gathered them all, carried them to the sink, and struck a match. The paper curled and blackened, smoke rising in delicate threads. The smell was sharp, cleansing. As the ashes cooled, I whispered, "That's enough." When the evening came, I stacked the boxes neatly near the door. I didn't know where I would take them yet, storage, donation, maybe somewhere far away, but I knew this was the first time I was packing for myself, not for anyone else. Before bed, I walked through each room once more, turning off lights, saying quiet goodbyes. The home that had once held so much noise was now full of space, and I realized something almost holy. Sometimes freedom doesn't look like leaving. It looks like preparing to. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'll start moving the boxes to the car. But for tonight, I'll rest in the company of my decision. And as I drifted to sleep, the soft rustle of cardboard became the gentlest lullaby I'd ever known. By morning, the house had changed its temperature. It wasn't colder or warmer, just hollow. Every sound bounced farther than it used to. The kettle whistle, the shuffle of my slippers on the floor, the soft pop of the toaster. I walked through the kitchen, noticing the echo under my feet, as if the walls were already forgetting me. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and cardboard. The curtain still held the sunlight, but it felt borrowed. I realized, with a strange calm, that this place no longer belonged to me. I had built it, paid for it, filled it with laughter and apologies. But somewhere along the way, it had shifted allegiance. It was her house in everything but the deed. There were traces of Lauren everywhere. The coffee mug she always used, the one with the chipped handle, sat untouched on the counter from her last visit. A faint lipstick print still marked the rim. The dent on the hallway wall from when she'd stormed out years ago. The couch cushion forever sagging where she'd sit, scrolling through her phone, half listening when I tried to talk. Ghosts of her were scattered in the dust. I opened the fridge. The cake was still there, the one from her birthday. Its frosting had hardened, the strawberries dulled to a bruised red. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if I should throw it out or take a slice as a souvenir of the moment I finally woke up. Instead, I closed the door quietly, as if I might wake something sleeping inside. I poured myself coffee and sat by the window. The neighborhood was waking up, dogs barking, a school bus wheezing to a stop, someone's radio humming a gospel song. Ordinary life went on, indifferent to my small revolution. I watched the street and thought, how strange that the world doesn't pause when your life does. My phone buzzed twice on the counter. Unknown number. I didn't need to check. I knew who it was. The silence that followed each missed call was the truest conversation we'd had in years. For a moment, I let my mind wander back. The day we first moved in, Lauren was 12. She ran through every room barefoot shouting, "This one's mine!" I laughed and let her choose. That night, we ate pizza on the floor and talked about how this would be our forever home. I believed it then. I believed everything she said back then. But now, the same walls that once echoed with her laughter felt like they were holding their breath. I could almost hear them whisper, "It's time." I went to the living room, where sunlight streamed across the family photos. There was one of her wedding day, her eyes shining, my hands steady on her shoulders. I had that look mothers wear when they think their job is finally done. I took the photo out of the frame and slipped it into a box labeled Past Lives. The empty frame looked honest, almost beautiful. Everywhere I turned, I found a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. The apron by the stove, the spare key hanging on a hook, the armchair by the window, worn thin on one side from years of waiting. I realized I'd been haunting this house long before I decided to leave. I walked to the hallway and touched the wall where she'd once scribbled her height in pencil. There were 5 little marks, the last one at 15 years old. I had promised not to paint over them. I kept that promise through every renovation, every heartbreak. But now, I picked up a can of white paint and a brush. My hand trembled, but I painted over the lines slowly, carefully, whispering, "You're grown now. You don't live here anymore. Neither do I." The paint dried fast, sealing decades in a thin layer of silence. By noon, the house looked like a photograph that had lost its color. Beautiful, but distant. I opened the back door to let the breeze in. The wind swept across the floor, nudging an envelope off the table. It was one of Lauren's old letters, a thank you card from years ago. "You're the best mom. I couldn't do this without you." The words hit differently now. I wasn't angry, just tired of earning them. I took the card outside, held it to the sunlight, and let it go. The wind carried it over the fence, out of sight. Watching it vanish felt like unclenching a fist I hadn't realized I was making. When I came back inside, I sat on the stairs, the same spot where I used to tie her shoelaces before school. I rested my hands on my knees and looked around one last time. The space was cleaner now, lighter, but not empty. It held something new, possibility. I thought of all the nights I'd sat in this house waiting for an apology that never came, all the meals that went cold while I hoped for company, all the mornings I'd woken early to make sure her world didn't fall apart. The realization washed over me like sunlight through dust. I wasn't abandoning this place. I was freeing it, and myself, from the weight of someone else's indifference. As I stood, my knees protested, but my heart was steady. I walked to the door, pressed my hand to the wood one last time, and whispered, "Thank you for sheltering me." Then I opened it wide and let the wind rush in. The house didn't sigh or mourn. It simply let me go. The morning I left, the sky looked bruised, gray streaks with veins of gold trying to break through. It matched how I felt, worn but glowing somewhere deep inside. The car sat in the driveway, trunk open, boxes stacked like small promises behind me. I'd packed them the night before, labeling each one with something I wanted to keep or release. Keep: old letters, quilt, passport. Release: guilt, fear, permission. I made coffee strong enough to taste like resolve. The house was still, the air dense with finality. When I picked up the keys, they clinked softly against my palm, a sound that startled me. For 40 years, that jingle had meant coming home. Now, it meant escape. The first step outside was the hardest. The wind carried the scent of rain, and the neighborhood was waking slowly. Sprinklers ticking, a dog barking, someone's screen door creaking. I slid the last box into the back seat, tucked a blanket over it, and closed the trunk. The click felt decisive. I turned toward the house one more time. The curtains moved slightly, though I'd left no window open. Maybe it was the air shifting, or maybe houses exhale when they're finally released. I smiled faintly. For the first time in years, I didn't feel owned by the past. When I started the engine, the radio came on by accident, a song I used to hum while driving Lauren to school. I reached to turn it off, but stopped. The lyrics hit differently now, about finding roads that weren't meant to be found. I let it play. At the first intersection, I hesitated. My hands gripped the wheel too tightly. My heart whispered old fears. Where will you go? What if you need her? What if no one cares? But another voice, quieter, steadier, answered, "You care, that's enough." So I drove. The streets were familiar at first, every turn haunted by memory. The grocery store where she once threw a tantrum over candy, the gas station where we'd sit eating ice cream in the car, the park bench where she told me, at 17, that she couldn't wait to leave this boring town. I passed them all, each one tugging at me like a ghost, tugging at a sleeve. By the time I reached the highway, the ghosts began to fade. The city shrank in the rearview mirror, a mosaic of old choices growing smaller until it was only sky. The open road stretched ahead, long, indifferent, beautiful. Freedom didn't feel grand. It felt quiet. No triumphant music, no cinematic tears. Just the hum of tires on asphalt and the soft rhythm of my breath syncing with the engine. For decades, I'd driven toward someone. This was the first time I was driving toward myself. I didn't have a destination yet, just an idea. A friend from my hospital days had retired to Vermont. She'd once written me, "There's a piece here that smells like pine and forgiveness." I'd kept that letter in a drawer for years, the edges frayed from reading it too often. Now it felt like a map. The miles unfolded, gas stations blurred into forests, forests into small towns. At one diner stop, the waitress, young, freckled, with kind eyes, poured me coffee and asked if I was heading somewhere special. "Anywhere but back," I said, smiling. She laughed softly and said, "That's a good start." I tipped her more than I should have. It felt like gratitude to the universe for sending me kindness from a stranger instead of the cruelty of blood. At a rest stop, I stepped out to stretch. The air smelled of pine needles and rain. A flock of geese crossed overhead, loud and determined, flying in their perfect V. I tilted my head to watch them disappear, wondering how they always knew when to leave and where to go. I'd spent my life believing women my age were supposed to stay, rooted, patient, endlessly available. But maybe the secret was migration. Maybe freedom came with wings you forgot you had until you started using them. Back in the car, I checked my phone. No missed calls this time. Just silence. A clean kind of silence, the kind that doesn't ache. I deleted every message thread with her name. My thumb hovered over the "Are you sure?" pop-up, and I smiled. "Yes," I whispered. The screen went blank, and the sky outside widened. Hours later, I pulled over at a lookout point. Below me stretched a river, wide and silver, winding through endless trees. The wind tugged at my hair, cool and alive. I leaned on the railing, watching the current move with such purpose, carrying everything forward, twigs, leaves, light. It didn't ask permission to keep flowing. For the first time, I realized that courage doesn't roar. It hums quietly beneath your ribs and whispers, "Keep going." So I did. I drove until night fell, the headlights carving a path through the dark. Every mile between me and that house felt like another breath drawn deeper. I wasn't running away. I was finally arriving, one heartbeat at a time. The motel was cheap but clean, the kind of place that smelled faintly of detergent and possibility. The neon sign outside flickered through the blinds, painting the walls with restless pink light. I sat on the bed, surrounded by stacks of paper, bank statements, insurance forms, handwritten notes I'd never had the courage to send. It looked like evidence from a trial where I was both defendant and witness. I began sorting through it all, one document at a time. My name. Her name. Numbers that told the story better than any photograph could. Each transaction felt like a breadcrumb leading back to my own erasure. Rent transfers, tuition payments, temporary loans that had become permanent. A trail of good intentions turned to debt. The laptop screen glowed softly on the table. I logged into one account after another, erasing her access, closing the automatic payments. My cursor hesitated only once, on the savings account I'd opened when she was born. I'd labeled it, "For Lauren's future." The irony stung. I whispered to the empty room, it was supposed to help her fly, not feed her appetite. I clicked, "Close account." Just like that, 45 years of sacrifice folded into one small confirmation window. I sat back and exhaled. The air felt different, lighter, as though the room itself had exhaled with me. The clock ticked above the mini-fridge, indifferent but steady. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a text, a thank you, a demand disguised as gratitude. There was only quiet. The next task was harder. On the nightstand sat a bundle of letters, bound with a rubber band gone brittle from age. They were all addressed to her, letters I'd written but never sent. The first one was from the week she left for college. "Remember who you are. Remember that love doesn't keep score." The second, from her wedding day. "I'm proud of you, even when you forget to be kind." Others were apologies I didn't owe. "I'm sorry for calling too much. I just wanted to hear your voice." I opened them all, one by one. My handwriting had changed over the decades, from steady and round to cramped and trembling. It was like watching my optimism decay in slow motion. I tore the first letter in half, then another, until the pieces lay scattered like pale confetti across the bedspread. The sound was soft but satisfying. With every tear, I felt something unclench in my chest. All those words written in hope, in guilt, in desperation, they had been a second language of captivity. I had written as if I could convince her to love me again, as if affection could be earned like interest. But love doesn't grow from begging. It blooms in freedom. I kept one letter aside, the last one I'd written, just days before her birthday. It began with, "I miss you," and ended with, "Maybe one day we'll understand each other." I folded it carefully, then walked to the motel sink. The water ran cold as I held the letter beneath it, watching the ink bleed into blue veins, the words dissolving like secrets too heavy to keep. When the paper fell apart, I let the pieces slip down the drain. Outside, rain began to fall, thin at first, then steadier. The sound against the metal roof was rhythmic, almost tender. I turned off the lights and lay back on the bed, listening. The neon glow seeped through the curtains, blinking in sync with my pulse. I thought of all the times I'd cleaned up after her. Spilled milk, broken glasses, the chaos of her teenage storms. And now here I was, cleaning up after a lifetime of emotional debris. But this mess was mine to claim. My liberation was messy, imperfect, and entirely mine. As I drifted, I imagined her face when she discovered the accounts closed, the transfers stopped, the silence on the other end of her demands. Maybe she'd curse me, maybe she'd laugh, maybe she wouldn't feel anything at all. It didn't matter. For once, her reaction wasn't part of the equation. Freedom isn't the absence of love. It's the end of servitude. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The rain had passed, leaving the pavement shining like liquid glass. I brewed motel coffee in a paper cup and watched the sky lighten. The world was still. I took a deep breath and whispered, "This is what peace costs." Then I packed the shredded letters into a trash bag, tied it tight, and dropped it in the dumpster outside. The sound of it hitting the metal bottom was dull, but final. Back in the room, my phone lit up. 5 missed calls, 3 new messages. I didn't open them. I deleted them all without reading. Then, almost on instinct, I reached for my notebook and wrote a single line. I am allowed to start over. The words didn't tremble. Neither did my hand. It happened 3 days later, on a Wednesday morning. I was sitting at a cafe tucked between a laundromat and a florist, sipping weak coffee that tasted like burnt toast when my phone started buzzing. I didn't have to check the screen to know who it was. The rhythm of her rage had a pattern. It started with one call, then another, then a text. "Mom, what did you do?" I stared at the message, the words flashing like sirens on a dark road. The waitress, a young woman with hair dyed the color of plums, glanced at me. "Everything okay, ma'am?" she asked. I smiled. Yes, everything is finally okay. Outside, the day was bright, almost cruel in its cheerfulness. I sat there, the phone vibrating in my palm, thinking how strange it was that an entire lifetime could collapse into a few silent taps on a screen. For years, I had been her safety net. Now, she was free falling. The next text came faster, angrier. "The transfers are gone. My account's empty. What the hell?" I read it once, then again, feeling nothing and everything at once. It wasn't joy. It wasn't revenge. It was recognition, the moment when the child finally meets the consequences the mother had always absorbed. Another buzz. "You can't just disappear. We have bills. Tyler needs school money." The same script, different day. I watched the dots appear and vanish, the unsent words hesitating like a conscience that couldn't quite find its shape. I didn't reply. The truth is, I'd rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times. I'd imagined her crying, begging, understanding. I'd also imagined her fury. But none of my fantasies prepared me for the reality, the quiet satisfaction of simply not answering. Silence can be louder than any lecture. 10 minutes later, a new message. "I hope you're proud of yourself. You ruined everything." I almost laughed. The irony was rich. For decades, I had ruined myself to keep her world intact. Now she would finally learn what it cost to build comfort on someone else's exhaustion. The cafe door chimed as people came and went, the smell of espresso mingling with cut flowers from next door. I watched them, anonymous and unburdened, and wondered how many of them were carrying invisible heartbreaks of their own. I finished my coffee, left a tip, and stepped into the sunlight. The air was crisp, the kind that feels like a warning and a blessing at once. I walked without a destination, my phone still buzzing in my purse. Each vibration felt smaller, more distant, as if her voice were being swallowed by the wind. Eventually, the calls stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like a ceremony. I imagined her pacing the living room of that big house, the house I'd paid for, checking her banking app again and again, her face shifting from disbelief to panic. Maybe she called Evan next, blaming him, crying about betrayal. Maybe she threw something. Maybe she said my name like a curse. But I also imagined something else. The pause after the anger, when the noise dies down and the truth settles in. The truth that no one is coming to fix it. No one is paying this month's bills. No one is rescuing her anymore. Freedom, I realized, doesn't always come wrapped in joy. Sometimes it arrives wearing guilt's old coat, whispering, "This is what love without conditions feels like." That night, back in my motel room, I charged my phone just long enough to see the notifications pile up. 32 missed calls, 7 voicemails. I listened to one, her voice sharp and breaking. "Mom, this isn't funny. You're being cruel. You don't understand what you've done. We could lose everything." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me like rain I no longer needed to hide from. "I do understand," I whispered to the empty room. "That's why I did it." Then I deleted every voicemail and turned the phone off for good. Outside, the moon was bright, round, unashamed. I opened the window and let the cool air in. It smelled faintly of wet asphalt and freedom. In the quiet, I imagined her sitting in that house, looking around, realizing how much of her comfort had been built by hands that were now gone. Maybe she'd feel anger, maybe regret, but for the first time, those feelings would belong to her alone. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Rest. Not the kind you get from sleep, but the kind that settles deep, steady, honest. That night, I whispered to the stars, "Let her learn what survival feels like." Then I lay down, knowing she finally would. The next morning, I woke to sunlight pouring through the motel curtains, warm and forgiving. The world outside looked clean, rinsed by last night's rain. I made coffee in a paper cup and sat on the edge of the bed, phone still off, hands still trembling, but not from fear. From release. And then, out of nowhere, a memory rose. So vivid it pulled me backward through time like a tide. Lauren was 5. She had been sick for days, feverish, cheeks red as apples left too long in the sun. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor, holding her tiny body against my chest while the shower steamed the room. Her fingers clutched my shirt, hot and trembling, her breath shallow against my neck. "Don't leave, Mommy," she whispered, voice small as a thread. "I'm not going anywhere, baby," I told her, "not ever." That promise, made in a moment of love and fear, would become my life sentence. I used to love that version of her, the little girl who believed I could fix everything. I remember her laughter when we played in the park, how she'd climb the jungle gym and yell, "Watch me!" And I always did. I never stopped watching, even when it hurt. There was another memory, too. Her 8th birthday. I'd saved for months to buy her a dollhouse, the kind with tiny furniture and a front door that actually opened. When she unwrapped it, her eyes filled with wonder. "You made this?" she asked. I nodded, though I'd bought it secondhand and repainted it late at night, hands cramped from work. "It's perfect," she said. That night, I sat by her door, listening to her hum while she arranged tiny furniture inside that little world. Somewhere along the years, she learned to close doors of her own. I traced the rim of my coffee cup and tried to pinpoint when that sweetness curdled into contempt. Was it college? Marriage? The day she realized I was ordinary, just a woman with bills and tired knees? I'll never know. Maybe every child must outgrow the fantasy of their mother. But Lauren didn't just outgrow me. She erased me. And yet, beneath all the hurt, I still loved her. That was the cruelest part. Love doesn't vanish just because it's unreturned. It lingers like smoke on fabric, faint, stubborn, impossible to wash out completely. I opened my wallet and found an old photo tucked behind my ID. Lauren at 10, smiling in a field of sunflowers, her arm thrown around my waist. We were both laughing. My eyes were younger, my heart lighter. I studied that image for a long time, until the lines blurred. It hit me then. How much of motherhood is memory work? You keep patching the past until it stops bleeding. But some wounds stay open no matter how carefully you stitch them. I thought of all the nights I'd prayed for her happiness, all the ways I'd carried her even when she walked away. And now, sitting in that quiet room, I realized I'd carried her childhood too. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every forgotten birthday card she never wrote back. They lived in me like ghosts asking to be released. So I began to talk to them. To the 5-year-old with the fever, I said, "I kept my promise, baby. I didn't leave. Not until I had to." To the 8-year-old with the dollhouse, I said, "You built beautiful things, even if you forgot who taught you how." To the teenager who rolled her eyes at me in every photo, I whispered, "I forgive you. You didn't know what love cost." The motel room seemed to listen. Maybe forgiveness doesn't need witnesses. When the tears finally came, they weren't heavy. They felt like exhalation, like the body's way of saying thank you for finally telling the truth. Later, I took a walk along the edge of town. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. I passed a small playground, the kind with peeling paint and a single swing swaying in the breeze. I stopped. For a long moment, I watched it move, empty but alive, and something in my chest softened. I realized that no matter how cruel Lauren had become, the child she once was still existed somewhere inside her, buried under years of bitterness and blame. Maybe one day, that child would remember the warmth of my arms, the taste of banana pancakes on Sunday mornings, the way I used to brush her hair until it shone. Maybe not, but that was no longer my burden to carry. When I returned to the motel, I placed the sunflower photo on the nightstand. "You can rest now," I whispered to it. "We both can." The wind outside shifted, lifting the curtains ever so slightly, letting sunlight spill across the photo. For a second, I could almost hear her laughter again, clear, small, and impossibly far away. Then it faded, leaving behind a silence so gentle it almost felt like peace. I used to think dignity was something people either had or didn't. I thought it was about posture, about holding your chin high while the world pressed down on you. But I was wrong. Dignity isn't posture, it's decision. It's the quiet, trembling choice to stop begging for the bare minimum. The morning that truth found me, I was sitting outside the motel on a cracked bench, watching the sky lighten behind the power lines. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and coffee from the cafe next door. My hands were clasped, still, as if in prayer. I hadn't prayed in years, not since I realized most of my prayers had been about other people's comfort, not my own. I breathed in deeply, the cool air expanding my chest, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel the invisible weight of someone else's expectations pressing on my shoulders. I was 69 years old, broke by generosity, but rich in clarity. I used to think motherhood meant surrender, giving everything, even your self-respect, because that's what good mothers did. But now I understood that surrendering too much turns you into a ghost. I had been haunting my own life for years, whispering, "It's fine," in every room I was dying in. I wasn't fine. I was exhausted, disrespected, emptied. And that morning, I decided that exhaustion would no longer be my language. I took out a notebook I'd bought the night before from a gas station, a cheap spiral one with a red cover, and wrote one sentence: "I owe no one my ruin." The words stared back at me like truth finally unmasked. Then I began to write more. Memories, fragments, feelings I hadn't dared name. I wrote about the small cruelties that had worn me down, the moments of humiliation disguised as humor, the nights I stayed up rehearsing apologies for things I hadn't done. Each word felt like pulling a thorn from my own skin. And the strangest thing happened. I began to feel taller, not in body, but in spirit. My back straightened, my breathing deepened. That's what dignity does. It doesn't make you proud, it makes you whole. Later that day, I drove to a small park on the edge of town. The grass was damp from morning dew, and the benches were still cold from the night. I sat under a tree, watching strangers pass. A woman walking her dog, a young couple arguing softly, a man jogging with headphones. Ordinary life. It was beautiful in its simplicity. I took out my phone, not to check messages, but to take a photo. The image captured a patch of sunlight breaking through leaves. I stared at it thinking, this is what freedom looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, just light where there used to be shadow. For years, I'd believed that love and suffering were twins, inseparable. That the more I endured, the more loving I became. But endurance without respect is not love. It's submission. And submission, over time, erases you. The turning point wasn't loud. It was a whisper inside me saying, no more explanations. I didn't owe anyone my reasons for leaving, my apologies for choosing peace, or my guilt for being alive when someone else wished me dead. I drove to a thrift store that afternoon and bought a small mirror. When I brought it back to the motel, I propped it on the table and looked at myself, really looked. My hair was grayer than I remembered, my face softer, lines carving stories into my skin. But my eyes were awake. They looked like mine again. Hello, Evelyn, I said softly. Welcome back. It felt awkward at first, talking to myself out loud, but then something in me relaxed. I smiled. I'd been waiting decades for that smile, the kind that isn't performed, isn't polite, isn't for anyone else's comfort. That night, I treated myself to dinner at a small Italian restaurant. I sat alone by the window, ordered lasagna, and didn't pretend to read the menu twice to hide my solitude. When the waiter asked if I wanted dessert, I said yes, tiramisu, and when it arrived, I didn't share a bite. People might call it loneliness. I called it recovery. As I ate, I caught my reflection in the glass. A woman still learning what freedom costs, still trembling under its weight, but no longer afraid to pay the price. When I left the restaurant, I walked slowly under the streetlights. The pavement gleamed, and my shadow followed beside me, steady, quiet, finally whole. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like anyone's mother, savior, or provider. I felt like myself, and that, I realized, was dignity. It took me 2 more weeks to gather the courage to cross an ocean. Not because I was afraid of the flight. After all, I'd faced turbulence far worse than clouds. But because I'd never traveled anywhere just for myself. Every journey I'd taken until then had been for someone else. To visit, to help, to fix, to comfort. This one was different. This one was for me. The idea came one morning while I was flipping through a travel brochure I'd picked up at the motel lobby. On the cover was a lake surrounded by mountains, the caption in small print, "Find stillness where you least expect it." I laughed softly. How ridiculous it sounded, and yet how true. Switzerland had always seemed like a fairy tale to me. Clean streets, clockmakers, chocolate, calm. But the image of that lake lingered in my mind for days, until it began to feel less like fantasy and more like direction. I booked the ticket online, hands shaking the whole time. 1 click to confirm. It reminded me of that first night I'd canceled Lauren's accounts, a small sound that changed everything. I didn't tell anyone, not a soul. The flight left from Boston on a Tuesday evening. As the plane lifted through the clouds, I watched the lights of the city shrink beneath me, each glowing window like a chapter closing. I whispered goodbye, not to the country, but to the woman who had once lived below those lights, waiting for permission to matter. When I landed, the air smelled different, cleaner, sharper, alive. It carried the faint perfume of pine and snow. My suitcase felt lighter than it should have, as though I'd left half my grief somewhere over the Atlantic. I rented a small apartment in Lucerne, on a quiet street near the water. The landlord, an older woman named Clara, greeted me with warm eyes and a pot of tea. "You came alone?" she asked in careful English. I smiled. Yes, but I'm not lonely. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what I meant. The days that followed felt surreal. I walked along the lake each morning, the mountains mirrored perfectly on the surface. Swans drifted close enough to touch. The sound of their wings slicing the water was the purest thing I'd ever heard. Sometimes I'd sit on a bench for hours, notebook in hand, just writing whatever surfaced. Memories, reflections, fragments of a life finally allowed to exhale. The people here didn't know me as anyone's mother or savior. I was simply Evelyn. The woman who bought fresh bread every morning, who smiled at strangers, who spoke English softly and carried herself like someone learning to inhabit her own skin again. Clara invited me to a small dinner one evening with her friends, mostly women my age, widows or retirees. They spoke in a mix of German and French, laughing easily, and though I didn't understand most of the words, I felt their warmth like music. When they discovered I was from America, they poured me extra wine and toasted to new beginnings. That night, walking back to my apartment, I stopped on a small bridge above the river. The moonlight rippled over the water, and the wind off the Alps carried the scent of rain and stone. I closed my eyes and listened to the distant church bells ringing across the town. Something in that sound reached inside me, the reminder that even endings can echo like blessings. I began to build small rituals for myself. Every morning, tea, writing, walking. Every afternoon, one new thing, an art museum, a bakery, a conversation with a stranger. Every night, gratitude whispered into the dark. I wrote letters again, but this time to myself. They started with Dear Evelyn and ended with I'm proud of you. Sometimes when I passed a family in the park, I'd feel that old ache stir, a mother's instinct to look, to compare, to wonder. But it didn't wound anymore. It just reminded me that love, once genuine, never truly dies. It simply changes addresses. After a month, I found a bookstore that sold English novels. The owner, a tall man with silver hair, asked if I wanted to host a reading circle. You have the voice of a storyteller, he said. I laughed, but something about the idea stayed with me. I began to share bits of my writing, small essays about aging, resilience, freedom. The women from Clara's dinners came, listened, cried. They said my words sounded like their own hearts speaking. One evening after the gathering, Clara squeezed my hand. You are alive again, Evelyn, she said softly. It suits you. I smiled. It feels strange, I admitted. Like breathing a new kind of air. She nodded. That's because it's yours. When I returned home that night, I stood by the window, watching the snow begin to fall. Each flake drifted slow, deliberate, unhurried. I thought of the years I'd spent rushing to please, to fix, to be enough. And now, at 69, I'd finally learned the art of stillness. The world outside was silent, wrapped in white. I pressed my hand to the glass and whispered, I made it. No one heard it. But for the first time, that didn't matter. It was a month into my new life when the first message slipped through. An email, not a call. I'd changed my number, but old habits die hard. She must have tried every way to reach me. The subject line was simple. Are you happy now? I didn't open it right away. I made tea, sat by the window, watched the fog roll across the lake. The swans were still sleeping, heads tucked under wings. Peace had become my new language, and I wasn't ready to let English guilt translate it back. But curiosity, that stubborn ghost, tugged at me. I opened the email. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. You really did it. You left. The accounts are gone. We lost the house. Tyler's confused. Evan's furious. You've destroyed everything. I hope this makes you feel powerful. Congratulations, Mom. You win. I read it twice. Then again, slower. There it was, the echo of entitlement wrapped in accusation, weaponized with the word Mom like it still belonged to her. I closed the laptop and set it aside. My tea had gone cold, but my hands were warm. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the reflex to defend myself. Her words didn't reach me. They bounced off the woman I'd become, falling silent somewhere between pity and relief. Over the next few weeks, more messages followed, each one a little less angry, a little more desperate. "You didn't have to go this far." Then, "We can fix this. Just talk to me." And finally, "Please." "I don't understand what I did wrong." That one I read carefully. It wasn't manipulation this time, it was confusion, raw and unfiltered. For a moment, my heart twisted. Maybe she truly didn't understand. Maybe she'd never learned what empathy felt like because I'd always shielded her from its lessons. Love without boundaries teaches cruelty. And I had been the best teacher. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but out of faith. Some lessons require silence. Later that month, I received another email. This one from Evan, short and stiff. "I just want you to know we're getting by." Lauren's, not herself. Maybe that's a good thing. She's working now. She talks about you sometimes. Says she can't sleep. You should know she misses Tyler's laugh in your house. He misses you too. I closed the message and let the words sit. Working now. I repeated them aloud, tasting them like a prayer. The world hadn't ended without me. It had simply adjusted. That night, I walked along the lake until the city lights shimmered across the water like coins tossed in for luck. I thought about Lauren, about how pain humbles us, about how falling apart sometimes teaches what love couldn't. Maybe losing comfort was the only way she'd learn compassion. Maybe this was her beginning too. A few days later, I received a letter, handwritten, forwarded from my old address. The handwriting was uneven, rushed. Inside was a photograph of Tyler, my grandson, holding a drawing. It showed two stick figures standing under a big yellow sun. One figure had gray hair, smiling. "Grandma Evelyn," the caption read. The other, smaller one had his name written above it, Tyler. Below the picture, in Lauren's handwriting, were 6 words that stopped me cold. "He drew this from memory of you. No apology, no plea, just that." But sometimes 6 words are enough to open a locked door. I placed the drawing on the table, smoothing the edges. My eyes blurred, not from sadness, but from something gentler. Grief and love had found a way to coexist, and neither one felt ashamed of the other. I wrote back, not a speech, not a lecture, just a single line. "Tell him Grandma loves him very much." Then I folded the letter, sealed it, and mailed it the next morning. Weeks passed without another reply, and that was fine. I'd learned that silence can be love too, love with boundaries, love with respect. I still walked by the lake every morning, still wrote in my red notebook. My story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebirth. But some evenings, when the bells rang across the city, I'd imagine Lauren standing somewhere far away, holding that drawing, maybe remembering the sound of my laugh. I hoped she'd find her own dignity someday, the way I found mine. Not through punishment, but through truth. And when I thought of the house she'd lost, I didn't feel guilt. I felt peace. Some homes must crumble so that the people inside finally learn how to stand. I looked out at the lake, the reflection of the mountains trembling in the wind, and whispered softly, "You're growing up now, baby." And so am I. Freedom has a strange way of echoing, especially in families that prefer silence to truth. The first ripple reached me through a cousin's email, a polite line buried between updates about her garden and her new hip surgery. "People are talking, Evelyn. They say you abandoned Lauren. I told them there's more to the story, but you know how families are." Oh, I knew. I'd spent my entire life learning that gossip travels faster than grace. By the end of that week, 3 messages had found me. One from my sister-in-law, one from a niece I hadn't spoken to in years, and one from an old church friend who signed off with praying for reconciliation. Each carried the same quiet judgment wrapped in concern. "Lauren's having a hard time. She says you're unwell. Maybe you should come home before things get worse. Come home." The phrase felt absurd, like an invitation to a house that had already burned down. I read their words without anger. Once upon a time, I would have rushed to defend myself, explaining, justifying, performing sanity for people who preferred their own version of the story. But not anymore. I had learned that the more you explain to those who thrive on misunderstanding, the smaller you become. One evening, Clara found me sitting outside the apartment, letters spread across my lap. "You look far away," she said. "I'm being rewritten," I replied. She tilted her head. "Ah, by people who were not there." "Exactly." She smiled knowingly. "Let them write. You are the only one who knows the ending." I folded the letters and set them aside. The air was cool, laced with the scent of rain and fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. "It's strange," I said. "They call me cruel. But if cruelty means survival, maybe I can live with that." Clara nodded. "Sometimes the world calls it cruelty when a woman stops dying quietly." Her words settled into me like stones in a riverbed, solid, grounding. Later that week, I received another email, this one from my younger brother, Mark. He'd always been kind but cautious, allergic to conflict. "Evelyn," he wrote, "I don't know what happened between you and Lauren, but she's telling everyone you cut her off out of spite. People are saying you're losing your mind. I told them that doesn't sound like you, but maybe you should explain yourself before the story gets away from you. Before the story gets away from you." I stared at that sentence for a long time. For decades, my story hadn't belonged to me. It was a collage of other people's needs, fears, and expectations. The irony of his advice made me laugh softly. "It's not getting away from me," I murmured to no one. "It's finally coming home." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my red notebook and began to write again. Not to prove anything, but to remember, to own it, to turn rumor into truth by the simple act of telling it myself. The next morning, Clara came by with fresh bread and 2 cups of tea. "They will keep talking," she said, as she sat beside me on the balcony. "Let them. Stories like yours make people uncomfortable, especially those who never dared to leave." Her words made me smile. "Do you think they'll ever understand?" "Understanding is overrated," she said. "Peace is better." That day, I took a long walk through the cobblestone streets, letting the noise of the market drown out every whisper from back home. I passed a group of tourists laughing, a violinist playing under an archway, children chasing pigeons. The world felt large again, wide enough for me to exist without explanation. At a small stationery shop, I bought a postcard, a photograph of the Swiss Alps at dawn. On the back, I wrote to Mark, "Dear brother, thank you for worrying. Please don't. I am not unwell. I am alive in a way that looks unfamiliar to those who never learn to choose themselves. Tell them that if they must speak of me, let them say this." Evelyn finally remembered her worth. I mailed it without an address for Lauren. She would hear the message eventually, through the same grapevine that once strangled me. That evening, I sat by the lake as the bells chimed across the city. I imagined my relatives' voices traveling through the air like smoke, twisting, distorting, vanishing. For once, I didn't need to chase them. I had my own sound now, the quiet rhythm of waves, steady, patient, endlessly returning to shore. By the time the last bell faded, I realized something freeing. I no longer needed to defend my reputation. Truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be lived. And I was living it. It began with a letter, not from Lauren, but from Tyler. The envelope was addressed in uneven handwriting, the kind that still struggles to find rhythm between childhood and adolescence. My heart stuttered when I saw it resting on the doormat outside my door in Lucerne. I stood there for a long time, afraid to open it. After all the silence, after all the walls I had built to protect my peace, a small piece of paper had the power to shake it. But curiosity, gentle, maternal, impossible to kill, won again. Inside was a single page. "Hi, Grandma," Mom said. "You're living near the mountains." She doesn't like to talk about it, but I found some pictures of Switzerland on my computer, and I think it looks really pretty there. I'm learning about lakes at school. Do you live near one? I miss your pancakes. Mom's are okay, but not the same. Sometimes she's sad and goes quiet. I think she misses you, even though she says she doesn't. I hope you're not mad at her forever. I hope you're happy. Love, Tyler. There were small smudges of pencil along the edge, a few eraser marks where he'd corrected words. It wasn't a plea, just a child trying to build a bridge between two continents of silence. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. His voice, his innocence, cut through years of bitterness like sunlight through storm clouds. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, the letter beside my cup of tea, the moon reflecting on the lake. I had promised myself that I wouldn't look back, that I wouldn't reopen doors I had sealed for good. But Tyler wasn't a door, he was a window, and windows are meant to let light in. The next morning, I wrote back, "My dear Tyler, yes, I live near a lake. It's big and blue and very calm in the morning. Swans visit sometimes, and when the wind is soft, it looks like the water is breathing. I'm glad you remember my pancakes. One day, when life allows it, we'll make them again together. Tell your mom that I wish her peace. Tell her I'm not angry. Sometimes grown-ups get lost trying to protect themselves, and it takes time to find the way back to kindness. Be patient with her. She's learning, just like I am. With all my love, Grandma Evelyn." I didn't know if the letter would reach him. I mailed it to the address I once called home, uncertain if she'd intercept it. But it didn't matter. The act of writing was enough. It was forgiveness in motion, compassion with boundaries. A week later, Clara found me on the balcony. "You look lighter," she said. "I remembered how to love without losing myself," I replied. She smiled. "That's the hardest kind." Days turned into weeks. I kept walking by the lake, teaching myself the language of quiet joy. I started volunteering at a local library, helping older women learn English. Sometimes I'd tell small parts of my story, never names, never specifics, just fragments about endurance and freedom. They'd listen, eyes shining, nodding as if they knew the same ghosts by different names. One afternoon, as I was shelving books, a tourist came in, a young woman from the States. She asked if there was free Wi-Fi and smiled politely. Her hair was dark and pulled into a messy bun, and when she laughed, something in her reminded me of Lauren at 20. I caught myself staring, heart tight and soft all at once. She thanked me, waved, and left. For hours afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about her. It hit me then. I no longer wanted revenge, or apology, or even understanding. I wanted grace, for both of us. That evening, I walked down to the pier with my red notebook. I tore out the first page, the one that said, "I owe no one my ruin," and turned it over. On the back, I wrote, "I owe myself forgiveness." Then I folded the page into a small paper boat, placed it on the lake, and watched it drift away until it vanished among the ripples. A wind rose, lifting my hair, carrying the scent of rain and pine. For the first time, I whispered her name not as a wound, but as a memory. "Lauren," I said softly, "I hope you find your light." The sky answered with silence, but it was a kind silence, one that held no resentment, only release. Some turning points don't come with thunder. They come quietly, disguised as a child's letter or the sound of water breathing. And that night, as I fell asleep, I dreamed of swans gliding across a glassy lake, their reflections unbroken. There are ghosts that don't frighten you. They just sit quietly until you're ready to listen. Mine arrived one sleepless night, in the soft hours before dawn when the world is half dream, half memory. I was lying awake, the moonlight painting my ceiling silver, when I heard my mother's voice. Not literally, not in the way people fear, more like an echo, familiar words I hadn't thought of in decades. "Evelyn, women like us don't get to rest. We hold things together. That's our purpose." She used to say that when I was little, usually while mending something, a ripped hem, a broken chair, a man. She believed endurance was the same thing as worth. I inherited that lesson too well. I remember her hands, strong, cracked from soap and cold water, always busy. She was 30 when my father left, and she never remarried. "There's no time for softness," she'd say, stitching her loneliness into tablecloths. I grew up mistaking resilience for happiness. Now, lying in a small apartment across the ocean, I could still feel the weight of that inheritance. How many generations of women had passed it down like a family heirloom? The duty to hold on, no matter how much it hurt? I got out of bed and wrapped a shawl around my shoulders. Outside, the lake shimmered in the dark, moonlight trembling across the water. I whispered to the reflection, "I don't want to hold it anymore, Mama." The room answered with stillness. I brewed tea and sat by the window, thinking of her, of the way she'd bite her lip when she wanted to cry, how she'd hum while working just to fill the silence. She never learned how to be loved without earning it. Maybe that's why I'd spent my whole life confusing sacrifice with devotion. For the first time, I wondered about her story, not as my mother, but as a woman. What dreams did she bury beneath duty? What laughter did she swallow so others could eat first? I had never asked. I'd been too busy proving that I could be better, kinder, more patient. I had turned motherhood into penance, the same way she did. Generational patterns aren't just behaviors, they're songs. And that night, I heard ours, clear as a lullaby. It began with her and ended with me, but it didn't have to. I took out my red notebook and began to write. Not to Lauren this time, not to Tyler, but to the women before me. "Dear Mama," I wrote, "you did your best with what the world allowed. You gave me strength, but you also gave me silence. I'm returning the silence now. I'm keeping the strength." Then I wrote another letter to the girl I once was. "Dear Evelyn, I'm sorry I taught you that love must hurt to count. You deserved gentleness long before you learned to demand it. Tears came easily, not heavy, just cleansing, the kind that soften, not destroy." The next morning, I carried those letters to the lakeshore. The air was cold, the kind that nips at your fingertips, but wakes something alive inside you. I read them aloud, voice low but steady, as if speaking into a mirror that stretched across generations. "I forgive you," I said, to my mother, to myself, to the lineage of women who had built their worth from service. The words didn't echo. They absorbed into the water, quiet and complete. As I turned to leave, I noticed an older woman sitting on a nearby bench, her hair white as snow, eyes closed, face lifted to the morning sun. She looked peaceful, untouched by hurry. For a fleeting moment, I imagined she could be my mother, what she might have been if someone had ever told her she was allowed to rest. "Beautiful morning," she said when she noticed me. Her accent was thick, her smile gentle. "Yes," I replied, smiling back. "Beautiful and kind." We talked briefly about nothing, weather, flowers, tea, but something about her presence felt sacred, as if the universe had sent a stand-in to receive my apology. When she rose to leave, she touched my arm lightly. "You have kind eyes," she said. "Use them to look forward." After she walked away, I stood for a long while, watching her fade down the path. I thought of my mother again, and this time I didn't feel grief. I felt gratitude. She had walked so I could stop walking. That evening, I lit a candle by my window, a small flame to honor the women who had carried me and the one I was still becoming. The reflection shimmered on the glass like a heartbeat. "Mama," I whispered, "we're free now." The flame flickered once, as if in answer. It happened almost 2 years after I left. By then, the rhythm of my days in Lucerne had settled into something soft and sacred. Mornings by the lake, afternoons at the library, evenings writing by candlelight. My body had learned peace the way it once learned endurance, through repetition. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, too careful, the kind of precision that hides shaking hands. I recognized it instantly. Lauren. I sat at my desk for a long time before opening it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than ink. Inside, her words were uneven, honest in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Dear Mom, I don't really know how to start this. I've written and torn up a dozen versions already. Everyone sounded wrong. I was angry for a long time, then scared, then ashamed. You were right to leave. You were right about everything. I don't remember when I stopped seeing you as a person. I think it was when you made it too easy to forget. You gave and gave until I thought that's what love meant. Taking. And when you stopped, I thought you were betraying me. But you were saving yourself. I can see that now. I lost the house. Evan left. It's just me and Tyler now, and he asks about you all the time. I tell him you're by a lake, happy. I want that to be true. If you can forgive me, if that's even possible, I'd like to see you once more. No demands, no explanations, just to see you. Love. Lauren. The last line blurred as my eyes filled. For a long time, I couldn't move. I had dreamed of this letter once, but always imagined it differently. Perfect words, tear-stained, full of regret. This one was simpler, flawed, human, and because of that, I believed it. Forgiveness doesn't rush. It walks with a cane, cautious but determined. I folded the letter and placed it on the windowsill. For 3 days, I let it sit there, touching it each morning as if to ask my heart if it was ready. On the 4th morning, I wrote back, "Dear Lauren, thank you for your honesty. It took me most of my life to understand that apologies don't erase pain. They acknowledge it. That's enough. I forgive you. I don't need grand gestures or explanations. I just want peace between us, whatever shape it takes. If you truly want to see me, come. The lake is beautiful this time of year. Love, Mom." 2 weeks later, she came. I saw her before she saw me, standing by the pier, thinner than I remembered, her hair shorter, streaked with gray. She looked smaller, softer, like the armor had finally fallen away. When she turned and spotted me, her face crumpled, and for a second we both froze. Then she walked forward, slowly at first, then faster, until she was running. And God help me, I opened my arms. When she reached me, she didn't speak. She just buried her face in my shoulder and sobbed, her whole body shaking the way it did when she was a little girl afraid of thunder. I held her the same way I used to, steady, wordless, forgiving. After a long while, she whispered, "I don't deserve this." I smiled through tears. Neither did I, but I gave it anyway. We sat by the lake for hours, not talking much. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was healing. Tyler joined us later, running down the path with his backpack bouncing, laughing when he saw me. He threw his arms around my waist, and I felt something uncoil inside me. Lauren watched us quietly. "He missed you," she said. I missed him too. The sun began to sink, staining the water gold. Lauren traced circles on the wooden bench with her fingertip. "I don't know how to make things right," she said softly. "You already did," I replied. "You came. We didn't talk about the money, or the house, or the years lost. Some stories don't need revisiting. They just need closure." Before they left, Lauren squeezed my hand. "You're happy here," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," I answered. "And I want you to be too." She nodded, eyes wet but peaceful. "I'll try." When they walked away, I stayed by the water, watching their silhouettes fade into the evening mist. The ache in my chest was still there, but it no longer hurt. It hummed, like a song ending on the right note. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like someone's mother or martyr. I felt like Evelyn, woman, survivor, whole. And as the last light kissed the lake, I whispered to the wind, "We're finally free." The morning after Lauren and Tyler left, the lake looked like glass. No ripples, no wind, just reflection. I stood at the window with my cup of tea, watching sunlight stretch across the water. For the first time in as long as I could remember, there was no ache in my chest. Not because everything was perfect, but because it no longer needed to be. Peace, I realized, isn't a reward. It's a choice you make every day, to release what once defined you. I spent that day in quiet rhythm. I watered the plants, fed the stray cat that visited my balcony, answered a few letters from women who'd read my essays online. My stories had started circulating beyond Lucerne, translated, shared, whispered among circles of women who recognized themselves in my words. Some called me brave. Others said I'd given them permission to breathe. I smiled each time, humbled and amazed that my pain had turned into someone else's light. In the afternoon, I walked down to the lakeshore. The air smelled of pine and rain, soft and new. I sat on my usual bench, the one where Lauren had found me 2 days before, and opened my red notebook. On the last page I wrote, "Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like freedom, because that's what this was, a kind of justice that doesn't require courts or vengeance. The justice of finally standing up from the ground you were forced to kneel on for too long." I thought about the Evelyn I used to be, the woman who apologized for breathing too loudly, who worked double shifts to earn love that never came, who confused patience with peace. I wished I could tell her that every sacrifice she made had meaning, even the painful ones. She had carried me to this shore, where silence no longer felt like erasure but rest. A family of swans floated nearby. The mother glided ahead, her wings curved protectively around her young. For a moment, I saw myself in her, older, slower, but still graceful. She wasn't caged by her devotion. She was free in it. That was the difference I had spent a lifetime learning. Behind me, someone called out, "Mrs. Walker!" It was Clara, waving a small parcel in her hands. "This came for you." I stood as she approached. "From America?" I asked, though I already suspected. She nodded. Inside the brown paper was a small notebook, Tyler's handwriting on the cover, Grandma's pancake recipes. I opened it and laughed through the tears that came instantly. Each page held a recipe I'd once made for him, illustrated with his messy drawings, pancakes shaped like stars, berries scattered like constellations. On the last page he had written, "Mom helped me with this one. We made them together. They tasted almost like yours. Almost." The word was perfect. It meant they were learning. I pressed the book to my chest and closed my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. Not just to them, but to every version of myself that had survived to taste this sweetness. That night, I lit a candle and placed the little notebook beside my own. 2 books, side by side, one filled with recipes, one filled with redemption. I wrote a final entry in my journal. I have no anger left, only understanding. She didn't destroy me. She revealed me. And I forgive her, not because she asked, but because I finally can. The flame flickered as if in agreement. Before bed, I stood by the open window. The bells of Lucerne began to ring, slow and steady. I breathed in the cool night air and whispered a quiet prayer, not to a god, but to the universe itself. Let every woman who feels unseen remember this. You are not a transaction. You are a story. And it's never too late to rewrite it. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, endless and calm. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Lauren and Tyler were building a life without the scaffolding of my sacrifice. I imagined them laughing in a kitchen, batter on their hands, the scent of pancakes filling the air. I smiled, knowing the cycle had finally broken. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. Not to flee this time, but to wander. Italy, maybe, or Spain. Somewhere warm where I could keep writing, keep breathing, keep living. As I locked the door behind me, I looked back one last time at the quiet apartment, the candle still burning faintly on the table. "Thank you," I whispered, to the walls, the ghosts, the lessons. Then I walked down the cobblestone street, the suitcase wheels clicking in rhythm with my heartbeat. The dawn sky opened above me, wide and gold. Justice wasn't a verdict. It was this moment, this breath, this freedom. And I walked into it, unafraid. If you've listened this far, maybe you know the kind of silence I'm talking about. The one that grows inside your chest until it sounds louder than any scream. I used to live there, inside that hush, inside other people's versions of me. But now, standing at the edge of my own story, I finally understand something simple and enormous. Peace is not a prize. It's a boundary. When I first heard my daughter say those words, "The best gift would be if you died," I thought it was the end of my story. But it wasn't. It was the sound of a door opening inward, into the room where my strength had been waiting all along. If I've learned anything at 69, it's that freedom rarely arrives with applause. It arrives quietly, disguised as small decisions, saying no, stopping the payments, packing the boxes, clicking cancel, choosing yourself. It's never pretty, but it's holy. I used to believe dignity meant holding everything together. Now I know it means letting go of what's killing you. It's looking in the mirror and saying, I deserve peace even if no one claps. When I look back, I don't see tragedy. I see evolution. I see the generations of women behind me, their hands raw from washing, their hearts trained to endure. And I whisper to them, we made it out. The cycle broke here, in me. My daughter and I aren't perfect. We probably never will be. But we found honesty. And sometimes that's all reconciliation needs. Tyler writes me now. Small, bright letters full of pancakes and baseball games. I hang every one on the fridge like trophies of a war finally over. People sometimes ask if I regret leaving, if I wish I'd done it differently. My answer is always the same. No, I wish I'd done it sooner. Because healing doesn't erase the scars, it teaches you to live beautifully with them. So if you're listening and you're tired of being the helper, the forgiver, the one who fixes everything while breaking yourself, please hear me. You are allowed to stop. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to choose silence, peace, and self-respect without calling it selfishness. I once believed love meant sacrifice. Now I believe love means truth. And the truth is, I'm still here. I am 69 years old. I live by a lake that breathes when the wind touches it. Some mornings I write, some afternoons I nap, and every night I whisper gratitude to the version of me who finally chose life. If Lauren ever needs me, not for money, not for rescue, but for love, I'll be here, whole, unbroken, waiting with open hands, but not empty ones. Never again empty. Because this, right now, is the woman I was always meant to be. Not a provider, not a punishment, not a saint, just Evelyn Grace Walker, a woman who lived long enough to call peace her home. Tell me, where are you watching from? If my story touched a place inside you, leave me a comment, share your city or country. Subscribe so we can keep healing together, one story at a time. And if you want to show love, tap that super thanks. It helps me tell more stories like this one. See you in the next life story with love and respect.